This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, Fauci's Great Betrayal. With us this evening, Jonathan Emord, a constitutional attorney who is the author of the new book, The Authoritarians, Their Assault on Individual Liberty, the Constitution, and Free Enterprise from the 19th century to the present. Jonathan, what an honor and a privilege to have you on the Glazov Gang.
My honor, really.
Thank you, Jonathan. We want to talk this evening about Fauci's Great Betrayal. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about you and this fascinating, very profound, and of course, very pertinent and relevant book that you have written and that has just come out. So let's begin. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a constitutional lawyer. I've been practicing for over 35 years in Washington and in the federal courts and agencies. And I principally have, in my career, I came out to Washington in the Reagan administration. I worked in the Reagan FCC and the Mass Media Bureau. I was an advocate for deregulation from the start. When I was a kid, they asked me to come to Washington, and I asked the chief of staff to Mark Fowler what he wanted me to do, and he said, "I'd like you to work for the FCC." And I said, "Well, I don't believe the FCC should exist, so how should I work for it?" He laughed, and he said, "That's precisely why we want you to come to Washington." So I left academia, went off to work in the Reagan FCC. Then when I left the FCC, I went into private practice and have been an advocate for really an original construction of the Constitution. And I've fought my whole career against government overreach, against instances where private enterprise has been harmed and free speech has been taken away as a result of government action, federal government action. So that's taken me to the present, and I've written 5 books. This is my most recent one, and this one was the most troubling for me to write, simply because I wrote it over a short period of time out of so much angst related to current events that I couldn't stop the production of it, because I was obsessed with trying to get out all the information in the shortest period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. The authoritarians, and I think the authoritarians are very much in power now. Something very scary happening in our country. Tell us a bit about your book. You trace the intellectual origins of authoritarianism.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize this, and this is what struck me in the beginning, made me want to write this book. But the authoritarian element, what we call essentially those instances in which people in power try to take away our rights for their own advantage, is a circumstance that has arisen early in American history and has become increasingly more powerful over time, such that the rioting that you see from BLM and Antifa in the streets is really just an outward manifestation of a ideological principle that has been embedded into the government of the United States for a very long period of time, and has housed itself rather quietly from public view in the administrative state. And so what I wrote about was the origins of authoritarianism in America, starting with the antebellum South, when the abolitionists pressed, of course, Southerners on the issue of slavery, and tried to induce the Southerners to be convinced that it was both anti-Christian and that it was a violation of the self-evident truths in the Declaration of Independence, and that they couldn't be committed to the Declaration and to the founding principles of this country if they were also wedded to slavery. And given the economics of slavery and the social standing of people in relationship to their black slaves. They didn't want to give it up in the South. And so they did something extraordinary, even though they were themselves the children of individuals who fought in the American Revolution and who had professed their love for Thomas Jefferson, who was a Southerner, and for the Declaration of Independence, his handiwork. They decided that they couldn't accept the hypocrisy of the self-evident truths of the Declaration and the institution of slavery. So they opted for slavery. And what did they do to justify it? They adopted Friedrich Hegel's concept of collectivism. And Hegel had conveniently defended slavery as a tool of collectivists, essentially that slavery was the means by which a superior race would advance, and that it was an ordinary or regular occurrence that a dominant culture would advance based on the backs of an inferior culture. And so he thought that European enslavement of blacks was perfectly consistent with that concept of progress, and that the common good, or the advancement of society, was justified in the case of slavery. So this was adopted by Southerners in defense of slavery. All right, well, we then have the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, but it did not abolish this Hegelian concept of collectivism. And so academics, North and South, after 1860, began to find this concept fascinating, and in droves they went to Bonn and to Heidelberg in Germany, Halle in Germany, and studied in the historic schools, which taught Hegelian collectivism, and more particularly taught condemnation of individual rights, of Lockean conceptions of the second treatise on government of John Locke, and also of the American Constitution. And despite, you would think that would not be received well by Americans, but in point of fact, academics received it rather well, because they believed that in the industrial age, a new America had to emerge, and that the Constitution defined a system of governance that was only appropriate for an agrarian society. And so they adopted this Hegelian collectivism, and they came back to the United States, and they instituted education in replacement of classical education. They advocated this new collectivism, socialism, in every university, in the principal university in the country. And then from there, they leapt from the university into what they advocated, which was the administrative state. The historic schools in Germany, and Bismarck's Germany, advocated the creation of an administrative state run by intellectuals who were called experts, that would divine what the common good was, and then compel the government to act, to adopt measures that would legally force people into following what the government deemed to be in the individual's best interest. And this is the same concept that came here, and that's how we got the administrative state. Advance forward through the New Deal, the administrative state then is writ large, and actually socialism is also writ large in the administrative state. And so this is the legacy of the administrative state. It's an unconstitutional enterprise. It combines legislative, executive, and judicial power in single hands, in violation of the separation of powers in the Constitution. It creates entities that are outside of the constitutional branches to create law, judge law, prosecute law, all without any constitutional authority, without any amendment to the Constitution to achieve it. And this is the handiwork of largely of socialists, of people who were authoritarians. And so, as I say, the handiwork for BLM and Antifa activists who are Marxists has been done already in the administrative state, and now we see its expression in the streets. And this, in no small measure, explains why there hasn't been any major crackdown on BLM and Antifa, because in point of fact, there are tremendous sympathies within the federal government for the ideology that they're advancing, that is for a Marxist overthrow of the United States.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that fascinating, succinct, short history and definitely how relevant it is to what we see now. Something you mention in your book that you document, very, very frightening, that I think one could argue very much interlinked with a lot of what we see now coming with the lockdowns and vaccine passports, etc. You show how authoritarians endorsed forced sterilization of 60,000 American citizens whom they deemed undesirable and unfit. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it is truly remarkable that from about 1904 to 1981, Americans have been institutionalized and forcibly sterilized when they were deemed unfit. This is part of the progressive era thinking and liberal thinking and authoritarian thinking led people to believe that the society could be reformed into a perfect society, into more of a utopia, if unfit people, that the individuals they deemed unfit, and that's a very broad category, and I'll explain that in a second, but if the individuals who are unfit could be sterilized and prevented from procreating on the false assumption that individuals who had characteristics that were undesirable would cause those characteristics to be inherited by their children, and this would create a perpetual regime. This was not something that was thought of by a few people to be appropriate. Indeed, almost every significant person in academia and in government in the period from about the turn of the 20th century to late 1920s believed this to be the case and advocated eugenics. Among those who were strident advocates of eugenics was a jurist who's credited as the major jurist of Western jurisprudence in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes. So Oliver Wendell Holmes believed, for example, he said that that children should be tested shortly after their birth to determine their relative aptitude, and if they didn't make the grade, that they should be killed. Infanticide he advocated strongly. He also believed that, as he said in Buck versus Bell, here we have a case, Supreme Court decision that actually ushered in a whole wave across the country of eugenics. He had a eugenics case that he presided over on, and the Supreme Court wrote the decision for the court, in which he said that this woman who, all the evidence, there was no evidence to support the conclusion that she was in any way, quote unquote, unfit. She was simply a person who had misfortune. She had a child out of wedlock that based on all the evidence appears to have resulted from a rape by a cousin of hers. She was living with her cousin's family at the time, and it appears that her cousin raped her and that she had a child out of wedlock. Out of embarrassment, the parents of that boy had her institutionalized on the notion that she was unfit or wayward or had bad morals. In other words, they blamed the rape on her, the person who was raped. And then the heads of the Eugenics Society in the state, Virginia, where she was institutionalized, advanced a case as it was a bogus case against her to see if they could justify their sterilization practices with law. And so her defense attorney was a total fraud. He was put up by the prosecution as a sham defendant, and he didn't present any evidence in her favor that was of any import. So the decisions went against her all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in a short decision, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. He called her an imbecile. There was simply no evidence whatsoever that she had even any problem with her aptitude or intellect. And that horrible decision then gave birth to eugenics societies and institutions across the country. And as I mentioned, some 60,000 Americans had been subject to sterilization between 1901 and 1906 and 1981 as a result of this legalization. But see, Oliver Wendell Holmes was a progressive, and he really thought majority will ought to justify every action, even if it's unconstitutional. If a majority favored it, he would deem it constitutional, he said.
Well, these are the wonders brought to us by the left. I don't think that any of this is being included in the teachings on critical race theory right now in our public schools or in universities. This is a very good and powerful transition into the great betrayal and into Fauci's great betrayal. Because, Jonathan, I think an argument could be made that there might be a danger here, because back then when we're talking about this forced sterilization, there were Americans that were seen as undesirable and unfit. Is there a possibility that perhaps somebody that doesn't have a COVID-19 vaccine passport could now be seen as undesirable and unfit?
Yeah, I think the parallel is a good one. It all originates from this notion that individual rights can be dispensed with for the quote unquote common good, that it's appropriate for those in government to dictate to us how we must live in order that we live in a way they consider to be better for them and presumably, although not always, better for us, but certainly better for them. And so they end up having no respect for individuals who dissent. So they force through their will by law and run roughshod over rights. Here we have an instance that's very comparable to that of the eugenics situation in this sense. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this problem. We have a virus that is a nanoparticle that doesn't know if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It infects everyone that it has an opportunity to infect. And the idea that people who choose not to be vaccinated should have their rights stripped away, such that they have no freedom to travel, that they have no freedom to enter into public places, that they may not have freedom of worship, that they may not have the right to communicate their ideas or exchange information about ways to deal with the COVID virus that deviates one iota from the official orthodoxy on it that big tech seems to censor in cooperation with the government. This does create an environment where if, for example, you can take someone's rights away because you perceive it to be in the common good to do so in this instance, what is to bar government from any other instance in taking away your rights? So, for example, it's an even more profound threat to human life that people are obese. And so we have people like Bloomberg in New York who would say the government ought to be able to take away sugary foods, ought to be able to prescribe essentially a menu that you must eat in order to live the life that the government thinks is appropriate for you. And it goes to these fundamental rights. We are given our liberties not because someone determined that we would act in the quote unquote right way according to some predetermined set of mores that have been adopted by the government. No, we have been given our rights against the state to be free and choose on our own, even if our decisions are ones that the state might consider to be in error. The only limitation upon our rights, as originally understood by the founding fathers and consistent with Lockean principles, is the idea that we don't have a right to deprive another of an equal right. We don't have a right to act against a person that would in some way harm that person. But if we're doing nothing more than existing, and we happen to have a virus that's running through our country, we ought not have our rights taken away simply because this is the virus du jour, and it is terribly inconvenient, is murderous in some instances. That's not the answer. We have a constitution. The constitution weathers every storm. It should. And it should certainly not be overthrown by a virus.
And what is happening in that context, what you just described, the authoritarians that are now in charge are betraying the American Constitution, are betraying all the values of freedom and liberty and everything the United States stands for. And this Dr. Fauci character and all the characters around him are involved in a betrayal of the American idea. You've written an article at PJ Media recently, The Great Betrayal, where you talk about this. Tell us about Fauci's great betrayal.
Well, Dr. Fauci in 2014 began authorization of funding for the Wuhan lab and experiments with the coronavirus. And that continued thereafter. And he was aware at the time, as he actually said in an interview, that there was risk to this sort of research. And that risk was that there could be potentially a pandemic. And he further said that when he considered the risks, he considered the benefit of scientific knowledge to outweigh the risks. Now, he then proceeds to enable Dr. Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Dr. Zazik at EcoHealth in Cambridge, to be functionaries, intermediaries between the government and the Wuhan lab, and to work with the Wuhan lab in this virus research, this bat virus research. He was aware that Dr. Zhijing Li, who was the head of virology at the Wuhan Institute, was an agent of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and therefore of the CCP, the Communist Party of China. And he was undoubtedly aware, as was every major figure in government in the United States, that the Chinese were intent on developing a bioweapons program that was overt in their own literature, military literature. And he was aware that in any event, he had no direct control over the research being conducted in Communist China by Dr. Zhijing Li. He had no ability to require them to use biosafety at the level required, which was a minimum of level 4. And in point of fact, that lab operated with a level 2 level of containment, which is woefully inadequate for the kind of research they were doing with hazardous material like the coronavirus. He was aware then later, by the time President Trump came into office, 1 week before, or 10 days before, on January 10th, 2017, Dr. Fauci gave a speech at Georgetown University Medical Center in which he predicted that there would be a surprise outbreak in the Trump administration, that is a pandemic. He made that prediction not as a clairvoyant person, but rather cognizant of the kind of research that was being done and the extent to which it was impossible to contain the virus given the low levels of biosafety at the Wuhan lab. Now, even if he did not have direct and full knowledge of the development of the coronavirus as it exists today in its final form, he was certainly aware that the United States, through his authorizations, was collaborating in the development of a dangerous virus that could potentially have a pandemic effect, which he said himself, with the greatest enemy the United States has, Communist China, that an avowed enemy that intends on achieving our destruction and intends on doing it in part through the use of bioweapons. So he knew he was playing with fire. He knew the risks. He knew that there was a distinct risk of a surprise outbreak. And yet, did he take then, after January 2017, did he take steps to cut off funding, to alert the administration of an imminent hazard, or to otherwise alert the public that there was a dire threat that existed? He said there would be a surprise outbreak with confidence. Did he alert the public to the dangers? Did he alert the White House? Did he tell anyone that emergency measures needed to be taken to ensure that this didn't happen? He did not. In fact, in December of 2017, he authorized an additional $5.96 million to be paid to EcoHealth for Wuhan lab research. And not only that, he was privy to the Department of Defense and their use of a cell 6 cell line that would be instrumental in gain of function research. And that cell 6 line was given by the Department of Defense to the Wuhan lab. And furthermore, he was aware of the gain of function research. In fact, it was in email correspondence to him, people were questioning, gee, this is rather dangerous, this gain of function research. How are we allowing this to happen? And he poo-pooed the risks, even though he knew that they existed. So he is a very, very culpable person. And I think at a minimum, we may say that he engaged in gross negligence, but upon a full evidentiary record, we may well find that he has committed an act that is totally treasonous, in the sense that he proceeded with an enemy of the United States to assist that enemy in the development of the coronavirus. Now, regardless of the level of toxicity that he knew or did not know, he had given the means to create that bioweapon to an avowed enemy of the United States. And that is a betrayal. And that is a grand betrayal. While he may be credited, as some have given him credit, for all of the work he did in HIV research, these acts alone discredit his achievement, because look at how many people have been destroyed worldwide by this virus. Look what it has done, the havoc it has wreaked on the economies of the world. And look what it is doing to our children, and how many children have committed suicide by the lockdown orders that he has urged and enforced. How many times, how much delay did he cause in our research to discover the origins of the coronavirus, which most certainly appear based on all sound evidence to be the Wuhan lab itself and human manipulation of the virus, when he said that it, with insistence, that it had natural origins, despite the fact that there was no sound scientific evidence to support that. We've never found an animal species that is a carrier of the Wuhan virus. And how did he not alert the American public to the risk of human transmission early on? And rather, he said instead that he thought that masks were not necessary and that nothing was necessary, because he did not anticipate that this would be a problem. Well, he said earlier, as I mentioned, in January to the university, Georgetown University Medical School, that there would be a surprise outbreak, that it would happen in this country during the Trump administration. So he speaks out of both sides of his mouth, but consistently when he acts, he has acted in ways that have harmed our interests and have advanced the interests of the PLA and the CCP against the United States. And now that he's let the cat out of the bag on the coronavirus, he's laid a foundation for them and precedent in the destruction it has had for a very successful follow-up with further more destructive bioweapons in the future. So there's a lot to this betrayal, and it's the betrayal that keeps on giving. And unfortunately, it keeps on giving to the Chinese and taking away from us and the rest of the world.
Right. Thank you, Jonathan. We had Peter Chauka on recently, that just in terms of this HIV matter, Chauka has shown that in terms of Fauci's work on that there was a lot of problematic details involved in that as well, but that's another matter. But Jonathan, you have just stressed, and you stress in your article at PJ Media, in other words, Fauci very much involved with giving an avowed enemy of the United States the capability, the wherewithal to create a bioweapon.
That's right. And it's not just Dr. Fauci, it's also our own Department of Defense. And this is because of the influence of Dr. Fauci in no small measure. And because he had made this determination, as he said openly years ago in his interviews, that he thought, even though this type of research was dangerous, that the benefit of scientific knowledge outweighed the risks. And this is not someone who is naive as to the risks. He knew that this could be a major pandemic. He knew, and in fact, he expected it. And yet he did nothing in the face of emergent information, as he was most certainly aware when he made the statement that there would be a surprise outbreak during the Trump administration.
That prediction, Jonathan, that quote unquote prediction is very troubling.
It's horrible. It's when you look at the history, he made that prediction and he was in a position to make a difference at that time. He still could have saved the nation. He still could have alerted the administration and taken the matter so seriously as to tell people that we have to cut off commercial interactions and transport of people with China. We have to insist on a full elimination of this program in China because of its risks. We have to cut off all funding. And even in the presence of executive orders, he did workarounds to ensure that the funding continued. Even in the presence of Obama's order cutting off funding, he or someone else caused an exemption to be placed within the executive order that allowed SARS research funding to continue, allowing the funding to continue for the coronavirus research. Then we don't know why, but then a year or so later, the Obama administration did an about face and overtly reversed its decision and authorized the funding to continue. Then the Trump administration comes in and cuts off the funding. While the funding is cut off, he nevertheless allows funding from NIAID, actually NIH, to continue to EcoHealth, which was then collaborating with the Wuhan lab on the development of the research for gain of function. So he's actually, he denies that he had any involvement with gain of function, but there's no question but that he had involvement with the gain of function. He uses a cryptic definition of the term gain of function, which is not in currency in his own department, is not in currency in the scientific community, simply is a form of definition that is largely unknown, except in his own mind. And his use of that definition enables him to say, I was not involved with gain of function. Well, gain of function, more broadly speaking and generally accepted, is simply research which is designed to enhance viral transmissibility such that it would exceed animal to animal transmission and would result in human to human transmission. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to make this virus capable of human-to-human transmission, purportedly because they would develop a vaccine against it, which is insane. Why would you create a virus that you would then say you needed to create in order to come up with a vaccine for it? And you would have that being done by an enemy of the United States that has every interest in using it as a weapon against the United States?
Well, Jonathan, I'll just speak for me here in terms of my lifetime of studying the left. And there's people out there that think that this is just, there's naivete here and they wish, they have good intentions and that there was just a little bit of negligence here. So once you begin to see that there's malice in the heart of the left, it all begins to make sense. I'll let you comment on that if you wish, but perhaps the motives are not what you want to discuss, but just presenting the facts. But I'll let you comment on that. But we gotta run. We wish we had another hour to speak with you. But in your last statement, perhaps you'd like to touch on what I just said. But also, is there any hope, Jonathan? Because you talk about how, in your article, you talk about how there needs to be FBI investigations. There needs to be congressional investigation in terms of what Fauci was doing and all these characters around him, and I would also call them demons. But it's so disheartening because they still can't get around to doing anything with with Hunter Biden's laptop. It's just, it appears that, you know, the intelligence agencies and just the government in general, aside from some heroes, we do have some heroes, right? But overall, it looks like the left is very much in control.
Well, I agree. And I think that we have a terrible corruption problem that is far reaching. It used to be that we respected the rule of law, we applied it without regard to what political stripe someone has. If they violated the law and they were a Democrat or a Republican, it didn't matter. They would be prosecuted for that violation. And that was when the rule of law had ascendancy. Well, now the rule of law is largely a victim of politicization, such that if it is consistent with your politics, you will create new rules that will go after your enemies. And this is third world politics kind of stuff. And this is only possible if people in government who have leadership positions do not respect the Constitution, do not respect limits on power, do not respect the rule of law. And that's what we have. And I think you're right. The tragedy is it infects the FBI, it infects the White House, it infects the Congress, it affects parts of the judiciary, it infects the Department of Justice. And as a result, we have scandal after scandal after scandal with no one paying for the price for it. We have people like Hillary Clinton, who violates the Espionage Act patently, would ordinarily be sentenced to prison for that. And instead she gets a pass because James Comey is engaged in a Trump coup attempt that is now well documented. So it is a tragedy. It is a loss of our country. It is a loss of legal standards, the rule of law, liberty. Everything is at stake, and we have to recover it. And the only way we can recover it is by being very active ourselves, being involved in these issues, not only voting, but actually appearing, making our silent majority silent no more, making it vocal, making it active in politics, and ourselves taking back this country, insisting on elimination of the administrative state, insisting on the rule of law being applied, insisting on law enforcement, insisting on, they've broken down the rule of law at the local level all the way up to the top. We don't have we don't arrest criminals anymore. We don't have bail. We don't have criminal prosecution of criminals. We don't have incarceration of criminals. I mean, across the country, there are instances where people who are committing heinous crimes, even murder, and being able to get off scot-free because of a corruption that is rife throughout our whole governmental system, from the local level all the way up to the federal level.
Jonathan Emord, thank you for being such a courageous truth teller, for being on the front lines in your own way on these certain realms in fighting for individual liberty, for the American Constitution, for the American idea. Many people are watching right now. They're going to get your book, The Authoritarians, on Amazon, but perhaps you'd like to get them to go somewhere else. Where can people follow you and also get your book?
Well, they can get the book on Amazon, as you mentioned. They can get it at Target, Walmart, Abe Books, Barnes and Noble. But I think, and then my articles occasionally appear in PJ Media, USA Today magazine, and then occasionally elsewhere. But my most important wish for our great country is that we once again remember who we are, what it means to be an American fundamentally, and that is defined really in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We are not a racist country. We are not a country of people who are selfish or fail to recognize justice. We are a just people. We are a generous people. We are a wonderful people of liberty that defines us throughout the world. And if we can regain that understanding of ourselves and wed ourselves to it against all these assaults, we can weather this socialist storm and come out on the other side a free people. If we forget who we are, If we say that we never should have been who we were and should be, then we will end up a socialist people. We will be slaves, and we will exist as in a state of mediocrity and poverty.
Powerful words and a powerful warning, and I would say amen to your words. Jonathan Emord, what an honor to have you here. Thank you for all your fighting for liberty, for the American Constitution, and for the American idea. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Honor to have you here. Thank you very much for watching the Glazov Gang this evening. Jonathan Emord, his book is The Authoritarians. Get it now. We'll see you soon on the Glazov Gang. Go to mypillow.com and use code GG21 to get incredible and amazing discounts. Or just call 1-800-854-0673. That's right. MyPillow.com is waiting for you. Start living like a king. Start being, for once, the coolest version of you. And all the while, you'll be supporting a true American hero that's fighting a true American cause. God bless you, and God bless America. And God bless Mike Lindell and My Pillow.